for inviting Best Self into your home today, Mark. You know, our paths have crossed many times over the last couple of years, but I'm really excited and honored to be here today and to have the opportunity to celebrate your incredible work in the world.
Thank you.
So before I get started, I think I want to give you a proper introduction to for our audience. So you just bear with me here. Dr. Mark Hyman is a man on a mission with a desire to set the record straight about all things food, systems, policies, and its connection to the environment, economy, social justice, personal health, and helping us figure out what the heck we should be eating in order to live healthy, vibrant lives. Dr. Hyman is the director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, chairman of the board of the Institute for Functional Medicine, and founder and director of the Ultra Wellness Center. I mean, you are a slacker, Mark. He is a 10-time #1 New York Times bestselling author and an internationally recognized leader, speaker, educator, and advocate in his field. His latest book, Food, is truly an ode to demystifying and debunking food myths, discerning complex science and making sense of it all. Thank God. Thank God. So, with no disrespect intended, I have to say this book is really good. And not that I didn't expect you to write a good book,
I'm not trying to take that.
But what I was really surprised was that I was going to be captivated by a book about food. And I love the way you laid it out. And it's really practical. You're not just like pointing out the problems. You're really offering solutions and empowering people how to redefine their relationship to food and obviously their overall health. So I think the best place that I would love to start with today is to really understand where this journey started for you. Mark Hyman decides to go to medical school, but how does that lead into functional medicine, and where does Mark Hyman make the connections to understanding that food really is the key to health and wellness?
It's a great question. It actually started before medical school, when I was in college at Cornell. And I moved into a house with a bunch of folks, and one of them was a PhD student in nutrition at Cornell. And he was studying the role of fiber in gut flora, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And this was, 4 decades ago.
Right.
And
nobody knew we even had gut flora at that time.
Yeah, no. But that's what he was studying. And he gave me this book that changed my life, which was called Nutrition Against Disease by a guy named Roger Williams, who was one of the fathers of the notion of biochemical individuality, how we're all different, and the notion that we can change disease, particularly chronic disease, by what we eat. And that book sort of set the framework in my mind of food as medicine. And at the same time, I also was studying systems theory and systems thinking and the connections between different healing systems and how the body works. And that sort of blended into this sort of predisposition to think differently about the body and health and healing. And I decided to go to medical school. I actually majored in Chinese, and I was going to go to China to study Chinese medicine, but I didn't want to spend my 20s in a fascist dictatorship. So I decided I'd apply to medical school to see if I got in, because I majored in Buddhism, which is a really revolutionary way of thinking about how our suffering and perceptions work. And I studied the medicine Buddha, which was really all about how we actually have to rethink our relationship to ourselves, our bodies, our health, our world. And with that, I went to medical school. And I got kind of brainwashed for the first bit.
In a good way.
I kind of decided just to suspend all my previous thinking and just take in this system as whole and see what happens. And I became fascinated with the body from that perspective. It was amazing. I had a great time in medical school. I became a family doctor and was always focused on nutrition and health and wellness. But for myself, I was a yoga teacher before I was even a doctor. That was like 40 years ago when nobody was doing yoga, and went to the yoga studio here in New York. It was one yoga studio, an East-West bookstore with 5 people in the class. And now, you're lucky if you can get a spot if you go an hour beforehand. And all that sort of led to a different way of thinking about things. And then what happened was I got really sick when I was about 36, about 22 years ago, and ended up having complete collapse of all my systems from mercury poisoning when I lived in China. And that led me to have to figure out what was going on, because no one could help me. No traditional doctors were helping me. And I had gut issues and cognitive issues and a severe muscle pain and autoimmune diseases, and all these things were happening. My whole systems collapsed. And through that process, I discovered this new model of thinking called functional medicine, which is a systems approach to disease. It's looking at root causes. It's really the science of creating health as opposed to just treating disease. It asks the question, why is this occurring instead of what disease do I have? More in medicine, we're focused on what disease do I have? What drug do I give? Based on symptoms and geography. Where is it in your body and where's the symptoms, as opposed to new thinking, for example, about the microbiome that teaches us that, wow, your gut flora may cause depression and autism and cancer and heart disease and diabetes and obesity and on and on and on, which doesn't make any sense given our current framework of disease, right? You don't go to the rheumatologist and they go, well, how's your gut flora? Or you don't go to the cardiologist and go, well, what's going on with your gut? You're having heart disease, right? But that's actually what the future of medicine is. And functional medicine is a way of shortening the gap from the science to the practice.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack, because first of all, I'm thinking of you as a college student and thinking, number one, how lucky you were to have come in contact with this information so young in your life, right? So it sort of planted seeds that you just don't take no for an answer, because I didn't know that you had this illness, but I can only imagine at that time that, doctors tend to just like run you through the traditional gamut of tests, right?
They wanted to give me antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication and sleep medication. This is really horrible, pain medication. I'm like, no, there's something going on here. I'm not depressed.
Right.
I know what's going on.
How fortunate that you had this sort of like yin-yang, Eastern, Western, that you'd planted all these seeds in your life.
Yeah.
You probably didn't really know what you were going to do with them all, but they really kind of came together and culminated at this point when you needed them most.
Yeah, through the retrospectoscope, you can see how everything connects in your life.
Hindsight's 2020, right?
And it's not even hindsight. It's really about understanding the flow of your life and following in different doorways and actually seeing how they all connect looking back. And everything I did and learned actually set me up for rethinking the way things are and asking the right questions. And so this is really all about a rethinking of disease and health. And we know that the most powerful drug on the planet is food. We had a woman in one of our groups at Cleveland Clinic this week who had been on insulin for 20 years, a type 2 diabetic, and within 3 weeks she's completely off insulin and medications, and her blood sugars are normal. That's the power of food. There's no drug that can do that.
Right. This notion of food as medicine, you and I were speaking off camera about this before. This is a discovery that I made in my own life really only, maybe 5 years ago. And I was never really truly understanding. I mean, I kind of pegged food, this is good, this is bad, but never really understood the connection of food as medicine. And as you say, the most powerful tool that we have is our fork.
Yeah.
What is it, Mark? Why are we not making these connections?
Because we've all been taught that food is energy, that it's calories, that you need it for sustenance to keep things going. But that aside from that, as long as you don't eat too much and as long as you exercise enough, then everything's fine.
As long as I'm thin, it's all is well, right?
Right. And there are a lot of people who are thin are not healthy, right? So it's not necessarily equated to thinness. But the idea that food is actually more than calories, that it's not all about exercising more and eating less. It's about actually the quality of the food and what that does to your biology that matters. You say, well, 1,000 calories of broccoli and 1,000 calories of soda, they're the same because they have the same amount of energy. No, they're different because they have different effects on your biology. In a laboratory, when you burn them, they're the same in a vacuum. But we're not a vacuum. We're a living, breathing, dynamic organism. So when you eat different food, it has information, instructions. It's like an operating system programming your biology with every bite. And it doesn't happen over decades. It happens over minutes in terms of your gene expression, your hormones that get produced. If you eat sugar, your stress hormones go up. Right? If you eat fat, they go down. If you look at how it affects your immune system, it regulates inflammation or is anti-inflammatory or inflammatory depending on what you eat.
Right.
It affects your brain chemistry, whether you produce happy mood chemicals or depressed chemicals. It affects behavior, and we know that violence can be caused by the wrong kinds of foods. We know it also affects your gut microbiome with every bite. So literally, with every single bite of food, you are literally giving your body instructions of either creating disease or creating health in real time. and it's powerful.
And it's simple.
And it's simple. And you don't focus on what you eat. You don't have to worry about how much.
Right.
You know, how many people are going to eat 10 avocados? Nobody's going to do that. You could easily eat 10 cookies, right? So that's the difference.
I want to acknowledge what I think is so wonderful. You work with individual patients. You work with organizations. You've worked with policymakers, influencers. You've collaborated with fellow leaders in the field. You've worked with, testifying before the White House Commission and the Senate. You've also consulted with the Surgeon General. You've advised world leaders, politicians, and celebrities. And you've even introduced the Enrich Act to Congress with our friend, Congressman Tim Ryan, to fund the inclusion of nutrition into medical education.
Yeah.
That is such music to my ears. Tell us for a minute, because I think this is a shocking statistic, how much nutritional education Western medical studies has.
Well, I would say relevant nutrition education, almost none. Less than 25% of medical schools have the recommended nutrition hours within their curriculum, according to the National Academy of Sciences recommendations. When you include the hours that are actually given, they're mostly about nutritional deficiency diseases, about managing people on, feeding tubes. It's not about using food as medicine. I would say that is almost completely absent from medical education.
Right. So when you got sick, where were you in your career? Were you in med school or?
No, I've been working for a number of years. I was a family doctor working in a small Indian reservation in Idaho. And then I worked as an ER doc for a few years. And then I got a job at Canyon Ranch in Lenox, where I was the medical director for this health resort. And it was about a half a year after that I got really sick.
And so how did you sort of start navigating your way out of that?
Well, I was really fortunate. I was a nutritionist at Canyon Ranch who introduced me to a guy named Jeffrey Bland, who studied with Linus Pauling, a PhD nutritional biochemist, who, in my view, is one of the smartest and most prescient thinkers in medicine. The ideas that he introduced to me 20 years ago are now becoming understood in medicine as relevant, which they hadn't been. So he sees the future by looking and scouring the literature and reading across disciplines. And so he presented a paradigm of medicine that was really different. And I said, well, this guy's crazy, or he's onto something. And if he's right, I owe it to myself and my patients to actually do something about it. So I started learning about it. I just started voraciously consuming research and learning and studying. And I realized it was a different way of thinking about disease. And it was like learning a language. And finally, I kind of got it. And I started to try this with people and saw extraordinary results, things that I just could never, ever imagine possible as a traditionally trained doctor. You
also mentioned in the book there, you say that you have 35 years of nutritional...
40 now.
Okay, 40.
I'm like, I went to 1978. I was studying nutrition.
You have a lot of nutritional education, but you state very clearly that the science is still confusing to you, and what we have to navigate through as general population. So if you don't understand it, how are we supposed to understand it?
Well, I think it can be confusing because of the way the science is done. So you've got, people, when I was in medical school, I thought science was this pure, unbiased field of truth.
We could trust, right.
And what I've learned is it's often
biased,
very corrupt, depending on who funds it. Marion Nestle, who's a nutritionist at NYU, is writing a book now talking about how the food industry corrupts nutritional science by funding studies that obfuscate the truth on purpose and then promote them and market them. Soda companies studied obesity. They find there's no link between soda and obesity. If Dairy Council funds studies on dairy, it's nature's perfect food, where independent studies find the opposite. 99%.
So they cherry pick their science.
99% of studies on artificial sweeteners done by the food industry find they're safe. 99% of studies done by independent researchers find they're harmful. So that's the kind of stuff we're battling. Plus, it's design of studies. You have to look at how they were designed, what the population was, when it was done, whether it proves cause and effect, what the basic science is. And that's really not part of the conversation for most. For example, meat is a great example. We've been told that meat is bad because we believe that meat contains saturated fat. Saturated fat's bad, hence we should not eat meat. Well, there was no proof of that. It was all based on some very poorly done studies that showed that saturated fat may be correlated with heart disease turns out not to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And when people were looked at who ate meat over long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of people through food questionnaires every year, the ones who ate meat seem to have more disease. But it turns out when you look at the characteristics of the meat eaters, these were people who weren't concerned about their health because the media was meat's bad. So if you ate meat, you were like, what the heck? These people smoke more, they drank more, they ate less fruits and veggies, they didn't take their vitamins, they didn't exercise, they drank more alcohol. Of course, they had more heart disease, right? Whereas the people who didn't eat meat were the healthy users. So they were biased to actually be healthy because they exercised, ate well, they avoided meat, but it wasn't the meat that was the problem. So we get really confused by these kinds of studies, and the average person doesn't have the scientific training to actually understand this. Even most doctors don't. They see these big studies and they see there's a correlation. They think it's a big deal. But if you actually look at these studies, nutrition are very hard to do. There's a lot of people in a resort for 10 years and feed them one diet and then switch them to another diet and see what happens. That's never going to happen.
Right. And then the point being, a study comes out and somebody in the general population has to say, oh, now I've got to dig and find out who's behind this study. It is really complicated. And that's what I was going to say to you. When did food get so complicated?
Yeah, we didn't really need doctors and nutritionists to tell us what to eat for most of our history of humanity, right?
Right.
And now everybody's confused. And I think that's really why I wrote the book, because everybody's confused. The government tells us guidelines that don't match the science. The media is confusing us. The science itself is confusing. The food industry's got their finger in there. So it's kind of a mess. But I really sifted through all that for people.
You really did. I have to say.
I really sifted through it. And I addressed all the controversies because I know what they are, because people ask me, what about this? What about that? Should I eat this? What about vegan? What about paleo? What about dairy?
What about those? So Mark, how are you eating now? Do you have a specific, are you a vegan or a vegetarian or a...
When you look at the data, you could believe anything, right? You could say, if you're a vegan, you say, well, if you eat meat, you're going to die. It's going to kill you. Eating an egg is like having 4 cigarettes, like some movies say that are out there that promote veganism. And if you listen to the paleo folks, if you eat as a vegan, you're going to get sick and die, nutritionally deficient and protein deficient, and you're going to be sick. So they can't both be right? So what is the truth that we know about nutrition? What can we distill that down to? What are the principles that are flexible, that can accommodate a wide variety of diets, that aren't rigid, but that are based on good science? And so I was sitting on a panel once with a vegan cardiologist and a friend of mine who was a paleo doc, and they were fighting like cats and dogs.
There you are.
And I'm like, well, if you're paleo and you're vegan, I must be pegan.
There you go.
And I joked, and we don't need another diet, and I did it as a spoof. But it's not a diet, it's a set of principles. And there are things that almost everybody agrees on, including the paleo and vegan communities and everybody in between.
Oh.
Right? Because you have low fat, high fat, low carb. Right. And so I basically just synthesized the research into some 12 really simple principles that people can follow. One, we should eat foods that are low glycemic. This is a powerful driver of all chronic disease. That's sugar and starch. These are foods we're eating in pharmacologic doses, 152 pounds of sugar, 133 pounds of flour a year per person. That's average. And we know that causes diabetes, heart disease, cancer, dementia, depression, and much more. Nobody's going to disagree with that. Second, we should be eating foods that are mostly plants. So we call it a plant-rich diet, not plant-based. So 75% of your plate should be non-starchy vegetables. Some fruits, not high amounts of fruits, because they can be high glycemic if you binge on tons of pineapple or grapes. And we should be eating a lot of good fats, avocados, olive oil, nuts and seeds. Nobody disagrees with that. Some people disagree on the saturated fat question. I think we can talk about that. The other thing is that we should be avoiding refined oils. And refined foods in all forms. I think nobody thinks we should be eating a diet that's rich in pesticides and herbicides and antibiotics and hormones and full of additives and chemicals and preservatives and dyes. Nobody thinks we should be doing that. We eat 3,000 food additives in our diet. We eat about 3 to 5 pounds per person per year of food chemicals, food dyes, for example. And that's never been looked at as a cohesive issue. And it's a big problem. It's linked to all sorts of behavioral issues and cognitive issues. We should be eating a lot of nuts and seeds. Everybody agrees that those are beneficial and healthful. We should be eating foods that are, if they're animal products, that are grown in a way that restores the soil, that preserves water, that doesn't treat the animals inhumanely. That's what we call regenerative.
Talk about that for a second, like
agriculture.
the connection of, I think sometimes people are disconnected from the fact that like what's on our fork affects our planet, not just our physical health.
So I was sort of ambitious in this book to try to make a simple, practical set of tools that people can use when they go to the grocery store in their kitchen.
By the way, I think you need to do an app because I think it's so practical and so well done that I would love to be able to pull it up on my phone.
Well, if you go to foodthebook.com, you can download the food roadmap, which I synthesized the entire book into one simple page.
Say that again so everybody knows.
Foodthebook.com.
You
can download the food roadmap, basically the food roadmap, which is basically a synthesis of the entire book of choose these and don't choose these.
Right.
So if you're going to eat meat, here's what you need to know. Don't eat this, eat this. If you're going to have dairy, here's what you need to know. Don't eat this, eat this. Look
for these labels. It was so helpful. I mean, even when it came to the meat, I loved the section about barbecuing and, what to watch, what not to watch, and, how marinades are helpful, how garlic and, rosemary and infusing with rosemary. I mean, I thought there were things in there fantastic. So I thought it would be so great to be able to have that as a list.
But I also, in addition to trying to make it really practical, I tried to connect the dots for people to understand that what they're eating isn't just a personal choice, that it affects the soil, it affects our water shortages globally, it affects climate change, it affects environmental degradation from nitrogen runoff into the rivers and streams and lakes that kills huge amounts of life, and we have dead zones the size of New Jersey, that it leads to educational challenges because kids are too sick to learn and then have achievement gaps where they end up having poor lives, less successful, less likely to go to college, where we have more poverty and violence and social injustice because of how our food system targets the poor and minorities, where we have even national security issues because kids are too sick and fat to fight, and 70% of recruits get rejected. And in the South, they're almost able to accept no military recruits because of the burden of disease in this population. And it affects the economy. Most of our economy is burdened by Medicare and Medicaid, and by 2042, 100% of our entire federal budget will be Medicare and Medicaid. Now it's a third of most states' budgets. It's the biggest driver of our federal deficit, and yet nobody's really talking about it. And it's because of the chronic disease that affects 1 in 2 Americans that's driving all of our economic
Do you hear your
crisis.
cats?
I hear my cats. Yoda and Bodhi, they're very rambunctious.
In terms of making those connections that you're talking about, from our fork to the planet, basically, I mean, meat is a really good example about just what you were just speaking about. I mean, it's so difficult to figure out what meat to eat, if it's okay, where do I get it, what does it have in it, did it have antibiotics that are now going to get passed to me? And so I appreciated how you broke down all the chapters and gave all these really tactical tips, like, for example, with the meat, to be like, if you don't live near a farm, to be looking for the label, the AGF label, right? American grass-fed, right? So can you just talk a little bit more about the meat?
Yeah, I think, we have been told that meat is a problem for the planet, it's a problem for our health. And there really are 3 issues when it comes to meat. And I wanted to be 120, so I wanted to know, is it something I should be doing? And I don't want to take other people's opinions. So I literally pulled all the best research on meat. It was a stack, this high. And I locked myself in a hotel room for a week and I read it all. And I studied it and I compared it and I looked at the patterns.
You geeked out.
I totally geeked out. And also looking at the other issues around environment and climate change and so forth. And I realized there are 3 issues. One is moral. I mean, if you're a Buddhist monk, and I have Buddhist monks as clients, then no, you don't have to eat meat. Then there's the environmental issue, which is a big issue. And factory farm animals are bad for the planet in so many ways, and I'll get into that in a minute. And third, health. And there are really 3, and they get conflated. The health issue, I think, the data is pretty clear on this. There is really no long-term harmful effects of meat, and there's probably a lot of beneficial effects. The question is, what's the quality of the meat? Is it factory feedlot meat? Is it a factory farm chicken? Is it a factory farm fish? Those are not great for us, and for a lot of reasons. From health points of view, from environmental points of view. As far as the environmental issues go, I just want to pause there because people go, well, yes, meat is bad for the environment. And I would agree. I think the way we grow meat in the planet is harmful. 70% of the world's agricultural lands are used to grow food for animal production. 70% of our fresh water, which is only 5% of the world's water supply, is used to grow animals. This is a bad idea. Plus, the way we grow the food depletes the soil, which then leads to the inability of the soil to hold carbon. And carbon is important because if carbon is released in the environment, it causes climate change. And the soil is one of the biggest carbon sinks. The rainforest is, yes, but so is the soil. In fact, it may be even more important. And we till the soil, we erode the soil. We've lost over 1 billion acres to erosion and desert.
No more nutrients.
No, and we grow in depleted soils. We also can't hold water. That's why we see droughts and we see runoff. I mean, in floods, right? We see droughts and floods because when the water hits these depleted soils, they can't hold the water and they will run off and cause floods. And the way we use pesticides and herbicides that particularly the nitrogen from industrial farming goes into the rivers and lakes and causes overgrowth of algae, which then
we want everything
kills the
fast
oxygen.
and
So it's a bad system,
right?
And it's causing an enormous environmental destruction. And when you look at the entire food system as a whole, including food waste and all the components, it's the #1 cause of climate change. So I agree, we should not be eating factory farm animals. But then the question is, what about meat? Well, if you look at the research on regenerative agriculture, it's really amazing. When you use animals to graze on lands, it can restore the soil. We had 60 million bison in this country 150 years ago. We killed them all to get rid of the Native Americans. And they produced tons and tons of topsoil, literally 20, 30 feet of topsoil in some areas in America. Now we've eroded that. But it's not the animals themselves, it's how we raise them. And we have 80 million cows. But if they were all on grasslands, which we can sustainably raise them on grasslands, we can raise them in ways that's better for us, better for the planet. It actually can help restore the soil. And estimates are that by doing this at scale, we can bring back carbon in the environment to a pre-industrial time. Basically, completely reverse climate change. So nobody really connects the dots on there. So people say, oh, we should eat less meat. Well, yes, the wrong meat, but the right meat, if we eat more of it and we actually change our agricultural model and we support that with subsidies instead of factory farming, we have an opportunity to really have a huge impact on our health and the health of the planet.
Right. And again, it's making that connection to what's on my fork came from.
Yeah.
And how it got here. Because you also had shocking statistics in there that with these farm-fed animals, with cattle, for example, that they were being fed, and this was legal, they were being fed candy in candy wrappers.
Yes, they're fed stale candy.
Stale candy, like
they're fed ground up animal parts. There's all kinds of junk
that
they eat. And you know, you're not what you eat. You are what you are eating ate.
Right. Which is exactly goes back into have they been force fed with antibiotics and how that.
Yeah, I mean, that antibiotic use in animal husbandry is a real problem because we're seeing tens of thousands of deaths a year from antibiotic resistant bugs that are caused by factory farming.
So let's also talk a little bit about how we're being led down a path, because how diet fads evolve and how everybody sort of like jumps on board with something. You say in the book that the food industry has invited itself into our homes and encouraged us to outsource our food and cooking. And this has been a breakdown of so many things. You think like the family dinner,
huge.
The relationship to food, right? And I
mean, this is actually fascinating because when you look at the history of how did this happen? How do we move from families cooking at home? I mean, in 1900, 2% of meals were eaten outside the home.
Right.
Now they're 50%.
Think about the tradition that went along with that. Like you remember your grandmother's kitchen. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what you remember is, the smells, the certain foods, what you ate every Sunday, for dinner.
And then after World War II, there's the rise of the processed food industry. And there was a movement at the same time to empower people to cook at home. They had federal extension workers that would go around to new families and teach the families how to cook and grow gardens and make real food. And there was a woman named Betty, who was a home ec teacher, who was very passionate about this and was very vocal about it. And the food industry got together and says, we can't have this. We have to figure out how to get our products out in the marketplace. So they decided to create this culture of convenience. So convenience became the prime value that we adhere to. And when that happens, we started sort of insinuating processed food into our products at home. Remember Betty Crocker?
I loved it when you brought that up in the book.
So I had...
We're aging ourselves saying we know who Betty Crocker is.
My mother had the Betty Crocker cookbook. And there was a picture of Betty Crocker on the front of the cookbook. And I thought Betty Crocker was a real person.
So did I.
And turns out she was a fabrication of the food industry. So General Mills convened a group, which probably should be, an antitrust thing now.
Which is was a brilliant idea.
To get them all colluding together to actually create this culture of convenience. And then they started doing things like getting back Betty Crocker cookbook, which was, if you remember the recipes, they were add 1 can of Campbell's cream of chicken soup. Or
to your casserole.
Add your Velveeta cheese or add your Ritz crackers to the whatever casserole. And so they then moved on to TV dinners and to more and more processed food and more fast food. And we end up, having this culture where Americans don't know how to cook anymore. They've literally hijacked America's kitchens, our taste buds, our brain chemistry, our metabolism, and we need to take them back. And
hijacked we know that by convenience.
And the family dinner has been disrupted. And the average family eats dinner 20 minutes, 3 times a week at most, each eating a different food from a different factory that's processed, packaged, and put in a microwave. That is not a family dinner, all while they're watching TV or on their phones.
Right.
And that breakdown has led to the breakdown of many important things we see. We see kids having more trouble in school, more behavioral issues, more anorexia and bulimia, more obesity. These other things have been shown to relate to the breakdown of the family dinner. And it's when you inculcate your kids with values and you teach them about food and how to cook. I cook dinner every night, even though I was a busy doctor, with my family. My son now, that's what he does for a living. He goes around and does chefs and hosts these events and cooks for people and teaches them about food because he learned how to do it. Not because I taught him, but we just did it together as a family.
Well, you also mentioned in the book that aside from, we should have this return to real, right? Moving towards real food. We shouldn't be eating things that perhaps we didn't find in our grandmother's kitchens or our great grandma's kitchens, right?
Yeah. Michael Pollan has a great little book called The 50 Food Rules. One is like, if your grandmother wouldn't recognize it as food, you shouldn't eat it, right?
Yeah. If it has 37 ingredients, it's not a food.
Right. It's like it's a food-like substance, right? It's like if the cereal turns your milk a different color, you probably don't want to eat it.
Right. So I do want to roll into the conversation, though. People will always say things like, that's great for them to say, but, organic is really expensive. I don't have a Whole Foods or I don't have a health food store or I don't have access to purchasing something online from a resource. So how do you speak to that?
Well, it's a real problem. There are real areas of food insecurity and food deserts in America where there's, 10 times as many fast food and convenience stores as there are grocery stores. But the research has shown that, the average cost of actually eating well is about $1.50 a day more, which for some families can be a lot. It's an extra $10 or so if you have a big family. But we actually know how to eat well for less. And I think it's a hierarchy of priorities. No, you don't everybody has to eat a grass-fed $70 ribeye steak, right? And nobody has to have to heirloom tomatoes. We can eat real food first. I think the first hurdle is getting off of junk, getting off of processed food, getting off of fast food and eating real food. And
boxes and cans and
I had a real awakening when I was part of the movie Fed Up, where we were doing a movie about the role of the food industry in pushing sugar and low-fat foods and driving the obesity epidemic. And as part of the movie, I went to see this family in South Carolina, in one of the poorest communities and one of the worst food deserts in America. It's a family of 5 lived in a trailer.
So just to define what a food desert is, just in case someone doesn't know.
Food desert is essentially a place where it's really hard to find real food. You can go get processed food in a convenience store, in a bodega, but you're not going to find a lot of really healthy food. And they had 10 times as many convenience stores and fast food restaurants as grocery stores. And they lived on a budget because they were on food stamps and disability. The father was 42 on dialysis from kidney failure, from diabetes. The mother was 100 plus pounds overweight. The son was 16 and almost diabetic, very overweight. And I went to their house. Instead of kind of telling them, here, you should eat better, go home, I said, let's make a meal together. So we went shopping, we got real food. I used a guide called Good Food on a Tight Budget, which is from the Environmental Working Group, where I'm on the board. And we just made real food. It's one of the cheapest, healthiest grains and beans, one of the cheapest, healthiest nuts. So every area of real food, we go into what are the cheapest forms that are still good for you and good for the planet and good for your wallet. And I said, here's how we cook. They didn't have anything in their house that was real. Everything they thought was healthy because of the way they're marketed to. And I thought they knew, but they just didn't do it. They didn't know. They didn't know that their salad dressing was full of high fructose corn syrup and refined oils and gums that cause leaky gut. They didn't know that their Cool Whip said 0 trans fat on the label, but because of a loophole in the labeling laws, but it was all trans fat and all high fructose corn syrup. They didn't know that their Jiffy peanut butter was full of trans fats and high fructose corn syrup, for example. And they didn't know how to chop a vegetable. They didn't have cutting boards. They didn't have knives. They didn't know.
And they're not alone.
No. And this is a deliberate thing that the food industry has done, is to subvert our food system.
And we're not shaming them. It's not.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, you were helping them. You were.
No, I was shaming the food industry.
Yes, no, I was saying the family.
No, I wasn't shaming
for not knowing.
No. I was. They were just. It was really just understanding that. Wow, they really didn't know. And as soon as they heard what was in their food, and I showed them the ingredients, and I cover over a box and show them the label, said, can you tell me what this is? And they wouldn't be able to tell if it was a corn dog or a Pop-Tart based on the ingredients, because they all look the same.
Right.
And so then we made this meal, and they loved it, and they thought it was delicious. And
was it turkey chili?
Turkey chili. Yeah. I made a salad with real lettuce, not iceberg lettuce.
Right.
Just olive oil and vinegar, salt and pepper dressing. We chopped garlic. We chopped some onions. Made turkey chili. We made roasted sweet potatoes. We had to cut our sweet potato with a butter knife because they didn't have actually a cutting knife.
Right.
And we roasted them with some herbs in the oven. Very simple, easy to make food.
And they were like,
I gave them
whoa.
They loved it. I gave them the guide. I gave them one of my cookbooks. I said, you can do this. And they did it. They lost a couple 100 pounds in the first year together.
Wow.
The son lost 50 and then gained it back because he went to work at Bojangles because there's nowhere to work as a teenager down there.
Right.
But he got himself together and he lost 128 pounds.
Wow.
And is now going to medical school. And if they can do it, anybody can do it.
See, that's the point. Now, that's obviously somebody that's living in a food desert.
In extreme poverty.
In extreme poverty. And that is a reality. And organic food is expensive, but it starts here. It starts with planting these seeds.
Yeah. And I go through in the book, what are the best sources of cheaper, healthy food? Like Thrive Market, for example, has awesome food at 20, 50% off of prices you'd find at Whole Foods.
Right.
You can find out how to get even grass-fed meats at a great discount by cutting out the middleman and going right to the farmer. There's ways of getting cheaper ingredients from all sorts of resources.
It's getting much better, right? Yeah. We still got a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
We also think that we can trust things, like when we see American Heart Association on something and there's like a check mark. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's made us confused is the subversion of public health organizations and advocacy groups by the food industry. So, for example, a large portion of the budget of the American Heart Association and the American Nutrition Dietetic Association and the American Diabetes Association, American Cancer Association come from the food industry. And so, for example, if you look at certain products in the grocery store, they have the American Heart Association seal of approval. And when you look at the foods that have it, for example, Trix are for kids, right? There's 7 teaspoons of sugar per serving. There's so many different kinds of dye: red dye, blue dye, yellow dye. You eat it, you die. And it's an unbelievable thing that they can actually put that seal of approval on that food. And yet, if it has any fat in it, they say it's bad. They have, for example, your yogurt is considered heart healthy, your low-fat yogurt. Right. When you look at the ingredients, the ounce per ounce, your low-fat, sweetened, fruit, strawberry yogurt has more sugar per ounce than Coca-Cola.
Right.
And it's frightening. So we have to understand that our public health organizations have been subverted and are not actually telling us the truth. And on top of that, advocacy groups like Feeding America, which is a hunger group, have been co-opted by them. So they don't want to promote soda taxes, for example, or promote food stamps not being used for soda. We have the NAACP and Hispanic Federation being funded by the soda industry, which is why they come out against the soda taxes, even though their communities are far more affected than any other communities in terms of their levels of obesity, diabetes, and their use of these products. So it really needs to be addressed, and we need to sort of protect these groups, and our government needs to step in and regulate these things so we don't have undue influence from industry shaping things. And also food marketing is targeted at these populations.
I think when I was listening to you talk about that family and that journey that you embarked them on, going back to the cost, that for them, that was such a big factor, but it's like we also have to point out, like, what's the cost to your health, and how much does that medicine and the dialysis and all of that you're, long-term trickle down?
It's true. I mean, right? So that, you pay now or pay later. Your cost of medications, being sick and off work and disability and the quality of life, those are externalities we don't include in our thinking.
In our equation.
And I think the other issue is that we don't include the true cost of the food in the price. So what is the true cost of a can of Coke? Well, when you count how we grow the corn for the corn syrup and how it depletes the soils and contributes to climate change and degrades the environment, those costs aren't included. When you count the costs of how it affects chronic disease, disability, in terms of how it affects productivity at the workplace, how it affects chronic disease, it affects Medicare, Medicaid, our overall economy, those aren't included in the price. I mean, why don't we make accounting for sustainability that actually includes these externalities in the cost of the product? Then a can of Coke might be $10 or $20.
I would think it'd be about $5.50.
So maybe grass-fed steak would be a lot better deal.
Right.
And then if we actually included the costs of the savings to health, environment by eating different foods and put those as discounts on the healthy foods, we'd see a big shift. In fact, there are proposals in Congress to actually make, for example, with food stamps, more expensive to buy junk food. And by the way, the number one item on food stamps is soda. And if you look at junk food as a whole, it's probably tenfold as a category, more than any other category of food that's purchased with food stamps. If we actually make it more expensive to buy that stuff and less expensive to buy fruits and vegetables and whole foods, that would shift purchasing and make a big difference.
Right. Well, I think also that beautiful story and your work is about planting seeds, because the bottom line is when that family started to sit down and prepare a meal and started to see the results of how that made them feel emotionally, physically, spiritually, how they started to feel about themselves, how they started to go out and interact in the world, I think that starts to empower people to demand more.
Absolutely.
And there's so much that we could go into here today, and it's in the book and it's fascinating. You just put it all out on the table. You call everybody out, on their bullshit, on demystifying the myths and the lobbyists.
So it's all in there, but it's like at the end of the day, it's a very practical guide. So you can get all into the minutiae of the environment and the politics and the policies, but at the end of the day, it's really meant to be a practical tool.
That's why I had so much fun reading it. It wasn't like reading a science textbook that was going to lose me and that I was going to, maybe flip through and use as a resource. It's not about shaming. It's about empowering. It's empowering us to re-navigate our relationship to our food and what we put on our fork and how that attaches to everything else.
Absolutely. People feel powerless in this world, powerless over politics, powerless over, the economy, powerless over environment. But the truth is we are enormously powerful. And the thing that we do every day is we vote 3 times a day with our fork.
Right.
We vote for its impact on our health, on our planet, on the economy, on politics, on social justice. All these things matter. And we have enormous power. Imagine what would happen if everybody on the planet decided to not eat any processed food for a day. Everything would change.
If you're telling me, or I'm experiencing, that changing my diet, changing my food, changing my relationship to my body and to my world is going to have a positive impact on these things, why wouldn't I try it?
Yeah.
What do I have to lose?
You could listen to me all day talk, and that probably wouldn't change anything. But that's why I encourage people to do a 10-day reset. In the book, it's a 10-day reset.
Okay.
Where you basically take out all the bad stuff, you put in the good stuff, and you see what happens.
Is coffee on that list?
Coffee, you could keep coffee, but generally I tell people to just get a break and see what happens. People use it for energy, but actually often people's energy is worse on coffee.
Right. And
it's better when they get off coffee. And so what I encourage people to do is don't listen to me, listen to your own body. Within 10 days, you'll see profound changes. We saw a 62% reduction in all symptoms and all diseases in just 10 days, whether it's your migraines or joint pain or fatigue or irritable bowel or allergies or sinus issues, in 10 days, people see dramatic improvements. So you don't have to listen to me. Listen to your own body.
So do you think people are unaware of the connections?
Yeah, people do not connect the dots.
Right.
I see patients of all different walks of life, and even the most educated, intelligent people don't connect what they're eating with how they feel.
Right.
And that's the only way to do it, is to change your diet radically. You can make incremental changes, but they often won't work, right? If you, let's say you're reacting to dairy and gluten, you just cut out dairy, you go, well, I still feel sick. Well, yeah, of course, because you're not getting rid of all the things. You have to kind of do a radical reset, and then you'll know, and you don't have to listen to me.
I love this book. I love your work. I am really thankful for the opportunity to sit down with you today and have this conversation. And I really want to thank you for walking the walk and talking the talk on behalf of us all, because you're really cracking it open, planting seeds, sparking something that we can all take charge. Like you said, we can find our voices, find our power, and become more healthy and vibrant.
That's the goal.
And I want to just leave one parting question for you. I'd like to know if you could close your eyes and wave your magic wand today, right here, right now. What would you change? What would your vision or your dream vision for the future be in regards to your work?
Well, I think it's to empower people to sort of understand how the choice we make really matter, and that if I were king for a day, I would probably do a sweeping set of policy changes where I'd create an intergovernmental food agency or food commission to look at these issues as an integrated global problem. And I would change the subsidies to support regenerative agriculture and remove them from industrial agriculture. I would change our dietary guidelines to match the science and not be corrupt and just confusing. I would end all food marketing to kids and of all junk food and any food that doesn't promote health. I would implement soda and junk food taxes, which have worked around the world. I would have a really radical different approach to food labeling that makes it clear what people are eating. Like in many other countries, in Chile, they put warning labels like on cigarettes, on breakfast cereal for kids. In other countries, they have stoplight, which is green, this is good, red, this is bad, yellow, eat with caution. And make it really clear and get money out of politics.
You have my vote for, king for the day. Thank you so much, Mark.
Of course.